All right, guys. This last chapter talks about integrating criminological theories that already exist. So we've got two main concepts here: theory competition, pitting theories against each other to see which one explains crime the best, and theory integration. So when we develop a theory, we want to make sure that it's actually a good theory. We want to make sure we can evaluate it. And one of the ways we can do that is we can look at data, right? So we can form a research proposal, test it with some data, and see what the data says. Using that data, we can either accept or discard propositions. We can engage in theory competition. This is a logical, conceptual, or empirical comparison of two or more theories. We look at that to figure out which offers the better or best explanation of crime. Finally, we could integrate theories. We could identify commonalities in two or more theories and synthesize them so that they become superior to either individual theory. No theory so far can explain all variations in crime. Theories also differ in terms of their policy implications. So you recall that each one of these chapters has talked about theory, it has talked about testing that theory, and it has talked about, if that theory is true, what are the policy implications for how we address crime. When each theory is first formulated, it's more or less based on prior theories and draws from a number of different sources. All theories over time then become revised from their original statements, usually based on what research has told us. So proponents of theories usually implicitly or explicitly compare its power, its ability to explain crime with other explanations. Hershey argued then that what passes for integration in criminology usually involves us ignoring some crucial differences between the theories. Akers agreed with Hershey that integrating theories without paying attention to things that make them incompatible really makes it useless. So in 1995, Bernard and Snipes argued that Hershey's opposition to integration is based on the fact that he categorizes theories into falling into three main categories: strain theories, control theories, and cultural deviance theories, which Hershey says are inherently incompatible. Therefore, it would be impossible to integrate them. Liska identifies three ways we can integrate theory. One is conceptual. We can look at concepts from one theory, and if they overlap in terms of their definitions and their meaning with other theories, we can integrate them based on those concepts. We could also integrate them based on their propositions. Do one or more theories, two or more theories, make the same predictions about crime? So enemy, social disorganization, and conflict theories all predict higher crime rates. If so, can we then use the variables from one theory to explain why variables in another theory vary, which can in turn be used to explain crime? Then there is within level integration, and that's only at the micro or macro level. So let's look at conceptual integration. Akers talks about integration by conceptual absorption. So Akers shows how some concepts and variables in social learning overlap with variables in social bond, labeling, conflict, enemy, and deterrence theories. If this is true, then we could engage in what he calls conceptual absorption. We could take concepts from one theory as special cases of things defined by another theory. So let's look at an example of this. Social bond theory talks about belief as a concept. This could be equated with the social learning concept of definitions favorable to crime. So for instance, strong adherence to conventional beliefs is one type of definition unfavorable to deviance. So there's nothing in beliefs that's not included in definitions, but definitions is broader than beliefs. So essentially beliefs is one type of definition. So then this element from social bond theory, beliefs, is one type of definition favorable to crime, which is a social learning concept. The social bonding concept of attachment could be a measure of intensity and differential association. Attachment could also mean how we identify with role models in social learning theory. One thing to keep in mind, though, is these commonalities don't necessarily predict the same things. So when we integrate concepts, it doesn't mean we produce propositional integration. Social bonds predict strong attachments inhibit delinquency, whereas social learning says if those strong attachments are to delinquent peers, that facilitates delinquency. So here we've got social bonds predicting two different things. Thornberry says, though, that when we subsume concepts this way, it isn't a fully integrated model. It stops short of that. Cullen and Colvin talk about social support and coercion. And Cullen proposes that social support can be used as an organizing concept that all criminology can be unified around. He says that social integration in a group in which emotional, material, and social assistance is provided to one another. So social support prevents crime. The greater the social support, the lower crime is. Colvin said coercion may be the unifying concept, whatever forces someone to act out of fear, anxiety, or intimidation. Crime then is a reaction or response to control. Colvin and Cullen teamed up to argue that there is an emerging theoretical and public policy consensus that coercion causes crime and social support prevents it. So then we can subsume a wide variety of concepts under this. So let's think about coercion, right? Within the concept of coercion would be coercive family discipline. Okay, so when people are using discipline that's coercive, that weakens social bonds, that it serves as a source of strain, that it is associated with economic inequality and repression. And you can see that this is connected to several theories. Or rather, that these are concepts from several theories. Coercion comes from interpersonal sources and impersonal sources, and it varies in terms of how strong it is and how consistent it is. This concept of coercion comes more from strain theory, right? If you think about this, what coercion here is talking about is sources of strain. The concept of social support is rooted in the Chicago school, right? And here we're looking at organized networks of our relationships with other people that can help us in meeting both expressive and instrumental needs. Our expressive needs are things that affirm our worth and value, whereas instrumental needs are helping us with physical or monetary needs. Social support then prevents crime. Informal social support is found in our primary groups, whereas formal social support is found in schools, criminal justice system, government organizations, agencies. And there's variation in the strength and consistency of social support. If you think just about your social support in terms of your primary groups, those closest to you, people vary in terms of how much, social support they can provide or do provide for you. But the stronger our social support is, the stronger our self-control is, and the stronger our bond to society is. These then counteract those effects of strain. So if we're experiencing strain, and if you recall, strain can come from a variety of places, then the more social support we have, the less likely we are to cope with that strain in a negative or potentially criminal manner. If we draw upon social learning theory, though, social support may not always lead to conformity. What if most of your support is coming from a deviant source? Then criminal behavior is more likely. So if you're getting your social support when you're experiencing strain from friends who cope negatively, you might then be more likely to cope negatively. And this is similar to the concept of differential opportunity. If you have less access to legitimate networks, if your connections and your role models are not positive, you're going to be seeking out social support then from non-conventional, non-positive sources. Colvin and Cullen didn't present any research testing this, but they did talk about what would the policy implications be. And essentially this would mean then that we would want to reduce coercion and increase legitimate sources of social support. We might see this done through restorative justice programs, through programs like Family Leave, Head Start, early intervention, things of that nature. What about then propositional integration? Recall that propositional integration talks about theories that predict the same outcomes. So Elliott proposed an integration of strain, control, and social learning theories. Strain, both in school and family, weakens our social bonds, which in turn promotes strong bonds to delinquent peers, which we know are the main factors in the commission of delinquency. And here we've got a nice little chart sort of demonstrating this for us. Elliott argued that strain, control, and learning theories have some basic assumptions, propositions, and implications that are similar. But there are also some differences, and we have to reconcile those differences before we can achieve integration. So, for example, control theory assumes everyone is motivated to break the law. But strain theory doesn't make that same assumption. Strain theory says those exposed to more strain are more likely to commit deviant acts. Whereas social learning proposes the variation in motivation to commit crime and proposes that there is variation in both our motivation to commit crime and to refrain from offending. In social bond theory, the content and direction of socialization is always conventional, so deviance results from weakened bonds. Whereas in social learning theory, it depends on the individual. Is the individual socialized to be conforming or deviant? Elliott reconciled this by taking the side of strain and learning theory. But Hershey says this isn't integration at all. All Elliott has done is rejected the assumptions of social bond theory. Hershey and others don't see a logical or empirical necessity to assume that motivation to commit crime is uniform. They don't see a reason to believe that all of us have the same propensity to commit crime or the same motivation to commit crime. Their integrative model begins with the assumption that there is variation in motivations both to conform and to deviate. Family and school, then, are our major sources of socialization, and Hershey proposes any strong attachment to them fosters the learning of pro-social behavior. So that conventional socialization begins at home, and if that is inadequate, weakened bonds may be enhanced by bonding to peers. If that peer bond is delinquent, we see a greater probability of delinquent behavior. Elliott tested this with data from the National Youth Survey, and the integrative model was strongly supported. So the original model said the main direct effect on delinquent behavior should come from bonding to peers. But most of the effect of strain and conventional bonding on delinquent behavior should be indirect via peers. The integrated model finds that bonding and strain variables have direct effects on delinquent behavior separate from how they affect individuals via their peers. That was not supported by the data. Only bonding to delinquent peers has a strong direct effect. That means then that the final model isn't really an integrated model. It best supports social learning theory. Krohn looked at network analysis by drawing on social learning and social bonding theory, and basically connected the structure of social networks and interactional processes. So he doesn't integrate two theories, but rather he bridges them. So he talks about social networks. Those are our individuals or groups linked by friendship or some other relationship, and personal networks, which is our links to other people. Krohn said one social network constrains individual behavior, and this is consistent with social control theory. But Krohn identifies two major characteristics of social networks. One is multiplexity, the number of different relationships that have two or more people in common, and density, the ratio of existing relationships to the maximum number of total relationships in a network. So in terms of multiplexity, the greater the multiplexity, the greater the constraint on behavior, and this usually lowers delinquency. So this recognizes what individuals do and the kind of activities in which they're mutually involved. Density means that when there's a small community, there's a high network density. The higher the density, the lower the delinquency. Haney analyzed friendship networks by asking respondents to identify their 5 closest female and 5 closest male friends. What they wanted to look at here then was the relative nature of these networks. So what is the ratio of delinquent and non-delinquent friends? That ratio is most strongly related to delinquency. So the proportion of delinquent friends has a stronger effect than did the absolute number of absolute level of delinquency among friends, the average delinquency, or the total number of friends, even taking into account prior delinquency. These are findings then that support social learning theory. Thornberry has what he calls interactional theory, where he integrates elements of social structure, social bond, and social learning. He argues that the underlying cause of delinquency is a weak bond to society, but that delinquency will not occur until we learn it. We learn it through our associations, it being reinforced, and our definitions. If this continues over time, delinquency can become a stable part of our behavior. These influences, however, so we go back and look at association, reinforcement, and definitions, they're not static. They vary by our age and during onset, continuation, and desistance. And they don't all run in one direction. A lower attachment to peers can lead to a lower commitment to school, which can in turn reduce the attachment to parents. So one can impact another, which can come back and impact the first. Thornberry didn't find support for his hypotheses about parental attachment and school commitment, but he did find that delinquency does impact attachment and commitment, and that those effects were greater than the effects of attachment and commitment. But his findings are weak. The relationships are weak. So again, look what we keep noticing here. Social learning variables seem to be the most significant. And one of the key variables in social learning theory is attachment to delinquent peers. Kaplan proposes a self-esteem derogation theory where he combines deviant peer influences, family and school, dealing with failure to live up to expectations, and self-concept. He argues that delinquency and drug use are the response of some adolescents to feelings of low self-esteem or derogation. Each person has a self-esteem motive to take actions that minimize negative attitudes of ourselves, towards ourselves, and maximize positive perceptions of ourselves. For most people, experiences in pro-social groups and conformity to their expectations, which is probably all of you guys, produce positive self-concepts. People for whom this is not true may turn to deviant groups to get rid of this low self-esteem, self-derogatory attitudes. So basically, if experiences within our family, school, or peer groups devalue ourselves, make us feel devalued, the social control that those groups exercise is less effective. So we're not motivated to conform, and we are motivated to deviate. As the team becomes aware of delinquent alternatives, they're going to gravitate towards those delinquent groups. To me, this is sort of similar of when we talk about, if kids can't achieve self-esteem or self-worth through conventional means, then they'll choose to be the best drug dealer or the biggest badass on the block. So persistence then in delinquency and drug use and escalation of that will continue if that is helping them develop basically a positive view of themselves. So deviance then serves to be a positive, even though deviant identity. It also helps them escape the stress. Research generally supports the hypothesis that deviance is a way of adapting to self-identity problems, but the strongest effects come from peer association, which again is social learning theory. Tittle talks about control balance. Control balance here for Tittle is the unifying causal process in criminal behavior. This is the ratio of how much we are able to control, how much we're liable to control, how much we're likely to control versus how much we're able to control. And there's four main variables in balance theory. Predisposition, are you motivated to deviate? Provocation, are there situations that would provoke you to deviate? Do you have opportunities to commit deviance? And constraint, is there a likelihood that we'll be subject to reactions by other people that constrain our behavior? This again is incorporating concepts from social learning, enemy, deterrence, and social bond. So when that control ratio is imbalanced, deviance is more likely. Individuals with control deficits will be predisposed towards predatory, defiant, or submissive deviance. Those with control surpluses will be predisposed towards exploited or decadent deviance. So the theory argues that deviance is undertaken to alter that control ratio, even if it only does so temporarily. So the individual has to then first perceive that a deviant act will alter the balance of control, have a situation, have an opportunity to commit that act, and then expect that the odds of being restrained from committing that act are low. Picaro, we talked about him before, found that control deficits are related to predatory offenses and defiant behavior. He also found that surpluses accounted for corporate exploitive crime. But we need further testing for this theory. And that wraps up our chapter on integrating theories and the last of our material.